In 1957, a television host asked Lucky Luciano a question so reckless that the studio didn't go silent out of shock. It went silent because several people in the room understood something all at once. They had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. No one shouted. No one stood up. No one rushed the stage. Instead, there was a delay, a hesitation, the kind that happens when the human brain realizes danger before the body knows how to respond. And then, 30 seconds later, the camera cut. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand something about Lucky Luciano. By 1957, Lucky was not supposed to exist. Officially, he was finished, a disgraced former gangster deported from the United States 10 years earlier. A cautionary tale the government liked to point at and say, "See? Even the biggest fish can be removed." But that was a lie, a convenient one. Because Lucky Luciano was never powerful because of where he lived. He was powerful because of what he built, and more importantly, because of what he knew. And television, in the 1950s, was the last place that knowledge was supposed to surface. Television was clean. Television was safe. Television was where America reassured itself that the chaos of the streets could be explained, packaged, and controlled. Gangsters belonged in newspapers, in courtrooms, in black and white crime photos. They did not belong under studio lights, which is exactly why The Interview was such a bad idea. The show was called American Profile. It aired live, no delay, no safety net. And it was hosted by a man who had made his reputation asking questions other people were too polite or too afraid to ask. Edward Mallory. Mallory wasn't stupid. He wasn't reckless in the obvious way. He was careful, educated, and deadly in the way only certain journalists are. The kind who smiles while cutting. The kind who believes truth is something you extract from others, not something that can turn on you. He believed Lucky Luciano was neutralized. After all, what could Luciano do? He was in exile. He had no crew, no territory, no gun, just a chair, a microphone, and a live audience. The producers thought they were booking a legend in decline. What they were actually doing was inviting a man with nothing left to lose into a room full of people with everything to hide. The studio that night was packed, not with criminals, but with respectable Americans, businessmen, housewives, veterans, people who had grown up hearing Lucky Luciano's name spoken the same way you'd say plague or war. To them, he was history. To him, they were scenery. Lucky walked onto the set without an entourage. No jewelry, no smile. Just a tailored Italian suit and the posture of a man who had outlived most of his enemies. When he sat down across from Mallory, the host extended his hand. Lucky looked at it, then looked at Mallory. And after a half-second pause, he shook it. That pause would matter later. The interview began politely, almost gently. They talked about prohibition, about exile, about regret. Lucky answered in short sentences, calm, measured, never defensive. He wasn't there to confess, he was there to observe. And then, right when the audience had relaxed, Mallory did something subtle. He stopped asking about the past and started asking about character. That's when the air changed, because history can be debated. But character? Character's where people bleed. Mallory leaned back in his chair, crossed his legs, and glanced at his notes, the posture of a man who believed he had control. "There's one rumor," he said casually, "that's followed you for decades." Lucky didn't move. "A personal rumor," Mallory continued. Still nothing. The audience leaned forward, sensing something unscripted was coming. "They say," Mallory said carefully, "that while you were building power in New York, you violated an unspoken rule." Lucky finally raised his eyes. Mallory smiled and delivered the question. Not the full accusation yet, not the name yet, just enough to signal what was coming. And in that moment, before the words even landed, Lucky Luciano understood exactly what Mallory was trying to do. He wasn't trying to expose a gangster. He was trying to humiliate one. And the thing about humiliating a man like Lucky Luciano is that sometimes the punishment doesn't come immediately. Sometimes it comes slowly, methodically, and live on television. Because the next sentence Mallory spoke would change the direction of the interview and set off a chain of events no one in that studio was prepared for. When Lucky Luciano was deported in 1946, the headlines declared victory. Mob kingpin exiled, end of an era. Crime syndicate decapitated. The government wanted Americans to believe that power worked like geography. Remove the man from the city, and the influence would evaporate. Lucky knew better. Power doesn't live in buildings. It lives in favors, in secrets, in men who owe you their freedom and don't even remember when the debt started. Italy was supposed to be his cage. Instead, it became his control room. From Naples, Lucky watched New York the way a chess master watches a board he already understands. He didn't need to make moves himself. He had people who moved without being asked, old lieutenants who still sent word, new bosses who pretended they weren't checking in. Lucky never complained about exile. That alone terrified people. Because men who whine are broken. Men who adapt are dangerous. By the 1950s, something strange was happening in the American underworld. No matter how many commissions were formed, no matter how many bosses rose and fell, certain disputes kept resolving themselves quietly. Certain wars never started. Certain men stayed alive longer than they should have. And whenever someone traced the calm backward, the trail always ended the same way. Italy. Lucky never issued orders. He didn't have to. He had memory. And memory in organized crime is more powerful than violence, because memory knows where the bodies are buried. It knows which indictments disappeared, which witnesses changed their minds, which men only became successful because someone else stepped aside. By 1957, Lucky was older. He walked slower. His hair was thinner. But what he carried was heavier than ever. Which brings us back to the interview. Why would a man like Lucky Luciano agree to appear on American television? The answer is simple. He didn't request it. The network requested him. They wanted legitimacy, ratings, prestige. They wanted to prove something. That America was no longer afraid of men like Lucky Luciano. That the system had won. Edward Mallory pushed hardest for the booking. He argued that Luciano was safe, neutralized, toothless. He's an old man in Italy, Mallory told the producers. What's the worst that can happen? What Mallory didn't know, what no one at the network knew, was that Lucky had already read Mallory's file. Not the public one, the private one. Lucky had a habit. Whenever someone showed interest in him, he learned everything about them first. Not because he was paranoid, but because he was disciplined. And Mallory's name had come up before. Quietly, years earlier, in conversations that were never written down. Lucky didn't agree to the interview immediately. He waited. Then he sent back a single condition: live broadcast, no editing, no delay. The producers celebrated this like a victory. They thought it meant transparency. They didn't understand what Lucky was actually asking for: a room with no escape, because tape can be edited. But live television? Live television is permanent. When Lucky finally landed in New York for the interview, he didn't announce it. No press, no entourage. He checked into a quiet hotel under a different name. He didn't meet anyone. He didn't need to. On the morning of the broadcast, a man visited his room. No names exchanged, no greetings, just a small envelope placed on the table. Inside were photocopies, letters, bank records, and one photograph Lucky had not seen in over 20 years. Lucky studied the contents carefully. Then he smiled, not because he was happy, but because now he understood something important. Edward Mallory wasn't just arrogant, he was careless. And careless men often confuse rumors with weapons. They forget that rumors can cut both ways. Back in the studio, Mallory believed he was in control. He had practiced the question all morning, the forbidden one, the one about Bumpy Johnson, the one about Bumpy's wife. He believed it would expose Lucky. What he didn't realize was that by asking it, he was reopening a file Lucky Luciano had closed a long time ago, and Lucky never reopened a file unless he intended to finish the business inside it, because some men survive exile. Others survive time, but only a few survive, knowing exactly when to speak. And Lucky Luciano had been silent for 10 years, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had been waiting for the right man to say the wrong thing. And Edward Mallory was about to do exactly that. By the time the red on-air light flickered on above the main camera, Edward Mallory was relaxed. That mattered, because men are most dangerous when they're tense, but they're most reckless when they're comfortable. Mallory believed this interview was already won. From his perspective, the board was set perfectly. Lucky Luciano was an aging relic, stripped of power, sitting under studio lights designed to expose every wrinkle, every hesitation, every crack. Mallory had done this dozens of times before. Politicians, union leaders, corporate thieves. He knew how to guide a conversation the way a surgeon guides a blade, slowly, politely, until the cut was too deep to undo. The audience, trusted him. That was his greatest weapon. They saw Mallory as rational, educated, clean. A man who represented order questioning chaos, civilization interrogating the barbarian. And Lucky Luciano understood that illusion the moment he sat down. The studio itself felt like a courthouse disguised as entertainment. Bright lights angled downward, forcing the guest to look slightly up, a psychological trick that made the host appear dominant. Cameras positioned tight, leaving no room to shift or retreat. The audience seated close enough to feel like a jury. Everything about the setup said one thing: you are being judged. Lucky adjusted his cufflinks and said nothing. Mallory opened with safe ground, prohibition, immigration, whether crime was born or made. Lucky answered calmly, almost politely. Short responses, no elaboration, no stories. Mallory mistook this for weakness. He thought Lucky was avoiding detail because he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. What he didn't realize was that Lucky wasn't answering to be understood. He was answering to be underestimated. Because the trap Mallory planned relied on one assumption, that Lucky still cared about his reputation. Mallory believed the rumor, the one about Bumpy Johnson's wife, would embarrass Lucky, that it would force him to deny, stammer, explain himself. And denial on television always looks like guilt. The producers watched from the control booth, nodding approvingly as the ratings ticker climbed. The audience leaned forward, sensing something sharper than nostalgia. Mallory shifted in his chair. This was the moment. He softened his voice the way he always did before a strike. "Mr. Luciano," he said, "you've spoken about loyalty, about codes, about rules." Lucky glanced at him. "Yes," Mallory nodded. "And yet, there were whispers you didn't always follow them." A beat. "Men like Bumpy Johnson," Mallory continued, "they were known for their discipline. Respect for boundaries." Lucky's jaw tightened slightly. The audience felt it. Mallory pressed. "Which is why people found it so shocking," he said, "that you would cross one of the oldest lines in the underworld." Lucky looked straight ahead now. No blinking, no movement. Mallory leaned in. "Did you have an affair with Bumpy Johnson's wife?" The words landed heavier than Mallory expected, not because of outrage, but because of what didn't happen. Lucky didn't flinch, didn't deny it, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he exhaled slowly through his nose. A man in the second row of the audience shifted uncomfortably. One of the camera operators glanced toward the control booth. This wasn't how the script went. Lucky turned his head slightly and looked at Mallory with something close to curiosity. "You know," Lucky said, his voice even, "there's a reason men don't ask questions like that." Mallory smiled thinly. "If it's false." This is your chance to clear it up. Lucky nodded once. Oh, I will. Mallory didn't hear the warning in that sentence because he was still thinking like a journalist, still thinking in terms of headlines, still thinking the worst thing that could happen was embarrassment. He didn't yet understand that Lucky Luciano wasn't defending himself. He was measuring the room, counting the exits, deciding how much truth it could survive. Because once a certain kind of truth is spoken out loud, it doesn't belong to anyone anymore. And in less than a minute, the conversation would stop being an interview and start becoming a reckoning. When Lucky Luciano finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward in anger. He didn't even look offended. That's what made it terrifying. Before I answer that, Lucky said calmly, I want to make sure something is clear. Edward Mallory nodded, still confident. Of course. Lucky turned his head slightly and looked past the cameras, past the audience, as if he were speaking to someone who wasn't in the room. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Lucky said slowly, was not a rumor. The audience stirred. He was not a headline. He was not a myth. Lucky's eyes returned to Mallory. He was a man who lived by rules most people only pretend to understand. Mallory cleared his throat. No one is disputing that, Mr. Luciano, but, Lucky continued, cutting him off gently, if you're going to speak his name, you should know what it costs. That was the first time the control booth shifted uneasily. Mallory laughed softly, trying to regain the rhythm. This is a talk show, not a street corner. Lucky smiled. That's what makes it dangerous. Mallory straightened. So let's be direct. Did you have an affair with Bumpy Johnson's wife? Lucky nodded once. No. The audience exhaled. Mallory leaned back satisfied, too quickly. But, Lucky added. The word hung in the air. But rumors like that don't appear by accident. Mallory's smile froze. They're planted, Lucky said. Carefully, by people who need two dangerous men to misunderstand each other. Mallory frowned. Are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Lucky said. I'm explaining something. Lucky folded his hands on the table. In the 1930s, Harlem and downtown were not separate worlds. They were mirrors. And there were people whose careers depended on keeping certain fires burning. The audience leaned in again. There were men in law enforcement, Lucky continued, and men in media who understood that if Lucky Luciano and Bumpy Johnson ever trusted each other fully, a lot of carefully built lies would collapse. Mallory shifted in his chair. So they spread stories, Lucky said, about women, about betrayal, about disrespect. Mallory interjected, sharper now. You're avoiding the question, Lucky looked at him. No, he said. I'm answering the real one. Mallory's voice hardened. Then let me make this very simple. Did you ever touch Mrs. Johnson? Lucky held his gaze. Never, the audience murmured. And I'll tell you why, Lucky added. Mallory hesitated. Why? Because Bumpy Johnson was one of the few men in America, Lucky said, who didn't need to ask if a rumor was true. Lucky leaned forward slightly now. He would have come to me, Mallory swallowed. And if I had done what you're implying, Lucky continued, we wouldn't be sitting here. That landed hard. The audience went silent. Mallory forced a laugh. That sounds like a threat. Lucky shook his head. No, that's respect. Mallory glanced down at his notes, visibly rattled. But you know what's interesting? Lucky said, his tone shifting again. The men who spread that rumor, they never worried about Bumpy. Mallory looked up. Why not? Because they knew he had a code, Lucky said. He didn't kill over gossip. Lucky paused. But they also knew something else. Mallory's voice was tight. Which is? They knew he trusted his wife. That sentence hit differently. Mallory opened his mouth to pivot, to regain control. Lucky didn't let him. And that, Lucky said calmly, is where your question stops being careless and starts being personal. Mallory stiffened. What exactly are you implying? Lucky looked at him for a long moment. I'm implying, Lucky said, that men who enjoy spreading rumors about other men's wives usually do it because they're hiding something about their own families. The control booth exploded into motion. Producers waved frantically. Mallory's face flushed red. That's completely inappropriate, he snapped. We're not here to discuss my family. Lucky nodded. Exactly. Mallory leaned forward, angrily. Then answer the question and stop deflecting. Lucky smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. You already got your answer, he said. Mallory shook his head. No, I got a story. Lucky's smile faded. And that, he said quietly, is why you're about to regret asking it. The red on-air light burned brighter, because the next thing Lucky Luciano was about to say was not meant for television. It was meant for Edward Mallory. And once it was spoken, there would be no editing it out. Edward Mallory had one rule he never broke. If a guest tried to turn the spotlight on him, he shut it down immediately. Redirect, interrupt, move on. But this time, something was wrong. Lucky Luciano wasn't posturing. He wasn't ranting. He wasn't even angry. He was calm. And calm men don't bluff. Mallory tapped his cue cards together, a nervous habit the camera had never caught before. We're not going to turn this into a personal attack, Mallory said, forcing a smile. The audience deserves facts. Lucky nodded. They do. Mallory seized the opening. Then let's stay with facts. Lucky leaned back slightly. All right, he said. Let's talk about facts. The control booth froze. Lucky turned his head just enough to keep his eyes on Mallory while addressing the camera. Fact number 1, Lucky said, is that rumors about Bumpy Johnson's wife came from a very specific place. Mallory's jaw tightened. Fact number 2, Lucky continued, is that those rumors were first printed, not spoken. Mallory swallowed. And fact number 3, Lucky said softly, is that the first man to repeat them publicly wasn't a gangster. Mallory's hand trembled as he adjusted his microphone. The audience sensed blood. Lucky turned fully toward him now. It was a reporter, Lucky said. Mallory laughed too loudly. There were dozens of reporters covering organized crime. Yes, Lucky said, but only one who kept visiting Harlem without writing anything down. Mallory's smile collapsed. Lucky paused, letting the silence stretch. You see, Lucky continued, gangsters gossip to intimidate. Reporters gossip to test reactions. Mallory leaned forward sharply. Are you accusing me of spreading criminal rumors? Lucky shook his head. No, Mallory exhaled. I'm accusing you of collecting them, Lucky finished. The audience gasped. Mallory stood halfway out of his chair. This is outrageous. Lucky didn't react. Your first trip to Harlem was in 1938, Lucky said casually. You weren't famous yet. You were hungry. Mallory sat back down slowly. You drank at a place on 133rd Street, Lucky continued, a bar that didn't like strangers. The control booth began shouting into Mallory's earpiece. Mallory touched the earpiece but didn't speak. You asked questions about Bumpy, Lucky said. About his wife? About his money? Mallory's voice cracked. This is hearsay. Lucky nodded. So is the rumor you asked me about. Mallory slammed his hand on the desk. Cut his mic. The producers hesitated. Live broadcast, no delay. Lucky raised his hand slightly, not to stop them, but to signal patience. You never printed what you heard, Lucky said. You took it somewhere else. Mallory whispered, to where? Lucky leaned in just enough. To men who could use it. Mallory shook his head violently. You're lying, Lucky shrugged. Maybe. The audience was dead silent now. But here's the part you forgot, Lucky continued. When you trade in rumors long enough, you stop remembering who they belong to. Lucky's eyes locked onto Mallory's. And sometimes, he said, they come back to collect interest. Mallory's breathing became shallow. What do you want? He asked quietly, forgetting the cameras. Lucky answered just as quietly. Nothing. Mallory looked confused. I already got what I wanted, Lucky said. Mallory frowned. Which is? Lucky gestured toward the camera. You showed everyone how easy it is to confuse questions with power. Mallory stared at him. And power, Lucky added, doesn't like being exposed. The producer's voice screamed through Mallory's earpiece. Wrap it up, now. Mallory swallowed hard and turned toward the camera. We're going to take a short break, he said, voice unsteady. Lucky smiled faintly. There won't be one, he said. Mallory snapped back. What? Because, Lucky said calmly, you booked this as live, and you forgot something important. The audience leaned forward. Mallory whispered, What? Lucky's smile vanished. You can't go to break when the truth is talking. The red light stayed on. The cameras kept rolling. And somewhere in New York, men who hadn't said Lucky Luciano's name out loud in years were suddenly paying very close attention. The control room was chaos. Producers shouted over each other. Engineers waved their arms. A junior assistant was already halfway to the phone, trying to reach legal. But the red on-air light stayed lit. Because once a live broadcast goes wrong, there's only one rule left. Don't make it worse. Edward Mallory sat frozen, staring straight ahead like a man waiting for a verdict. Lucky Luciano looked comfortable. That terrified everyone watching. Mallory cleared his throat. Mr. Luciano, we're going to steer this conversation back to a producer burst through the studio door. That alone was a violation. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't look at Lucky. He leaned down and whispered something into Mallory's ear. Mallory's face drained of color. What? Mallory whispered back. The producer shook his head. You need to hear it yourself. Mallory pulled away from the desk. Microphone. We're in the middle of a live... I know, the producer said. That's why this matters. The audience watched in confused silence as Mallory was handed a telephone. A real one, not a studio prop. Lucky noticed immediately. He tilted his head just slightly. Mallory hesitated, then lifted the receiver. Hello? He said. Whatever came through that line hit him like a punch. His posture collapsed. His free hand gripped the edge of the desk. Lucky looked at him with quiet interest. No, Mallory said into the phone. That's not possible. A pause. I didn't... Mallory stopped himself, glanced at the cameras, then lowered his voice. I didn't think anyone remembered that. Lucky's eyes narrowed. Mallory swallowed hard. Yes, he whispered. I understand. Another pause. Mallory's shoulders sagged. I understand, he repeated. He slowly placed the receiver back on the desk. The studio was silent. Mallory stared at the phone as if it might explode. Lucky spoke gently. You see, he said, this is why I didn't stop you earlier. Mallory didn't respond. Because questions, Lucky continued, have a way of traveling. Mallory finally turned toward him. His voice was barely audible. Who is that? Lucky smiled faintly. A man who doesn't like his past being disturbed, he said. And a man who still answers when certain names come up. Mallory shook his head. You orchestrated this. Lucky shook his head too. No, he said. I allowed it. The audience sat in stunned silence. Mallory leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. What do you want from me? Lucky's expression softened, almost pitying. I want you to finish the interview, he said. Mallory laughed weakly. After this, there's nothing left. Lucky leaned in. There's always something left, he said. Especially when a man realizes he's not the one asking the questions anymore. Mallory looked at the camera, at the audience, at the red light. He understood now. This wasn't an interview that went wrong. It was an interview that had been allowed to happen. Somewhere outside the studio, old alliances were waking up. Old favors were being counted, and old mistakes, Mallory's mistakes, were suddenly relevant again. Lucky leaned back in his chair. "We can keep going," he said calmly. Mallory didn't answer, because for the first time in his career, Edward Mallory understood what it felt like to be on the other side of the lens, and he knew, deep down, that when this broadcast ended, nothing about his life would return to normal. The broadcast ended without a sign-off. No closing music, no credits, just a hard cut to black. For the first time in the network's history, executives didn't know what they'd just aired, only that they couldn't undo it. Phones began ringing before the screen even went dark. Sponsors, lawyers, government contacts who hadn't called that building in years, and every single one of them asked the same question in different ways. "Why did you let him talk?" Inside the studio, no one moved. Edward Mallory remained seated long after the cameras stopped rolling. His notes lay untouched. His hands were flat on the desk, palms down, like he was grounding himself to reality. Lucky Luciano stood up slowly. No guards approached him. No producer stopped him. No one made eye contact. Power had shifted, not loudly, not violently, but unmistakably. As Lucky adjusted his coat, he leaned toward Mallory one last time. "You did very well," Lucky said softly. Mallory looked up, hollow-eyed. "I don't understand." Lucky nodded. "Most men don't. That's how they get into trouble." Then he walked off the set. No escort, no applause, no goodbye. Within an hour, the network issued a statement calling the interview unstructured and regrettable. By morning, clips of the broadcast were already disappearing. But something strange happened. The footage didn't vanish. It fragmented. Copied recordings circulated privately, passed hand to hand, played in back rooms, replayed in offices where decisions were made without paperwork. Men didn't talk about what Lucky said. They talked about what Mallory looked like when the phone rang, because fear is contagious. And on that broadcast, fear had been visible. Edward Mallory took a leave of absence 2 days later. Officially, it was exhaustion. Unofficially, his sources stopped returning calls. Stories he had been promised evaporated. Invitations dried up. And then came the audits. Tax questions, ethics reviews, old notes requested by new hands. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, just pressure. The kind that doesn't break bones, it breaks routines. Mallory stopped appearing in public. When he finally returned to television months later, it wasn't the same show. And it wasn't the same man. His questions were safer. His tone was softer. The edge was gone. Because once you felt what it's like to be truly exposed, you don't rush back into the light. Lucky Luciano left the country the same way he entered it. Quietly, no interviews, no statements, no follow-ups. But in the years that followed, something became clear to those who paid attention. No major publication ever repeated the rumor about Bumpy Johnson's wife again. Not once. It didn't matter whether it was true or false. It had been buried. Not by force, but by understanding. Because the most powerful message Lucky Luciano sent that night wasn't about crime. It was about restraint, about timing, about what happens when a man mistakes curiosity for control. And yet, there was one loose end, one detail that never made it on air, one part of that night that the network never explained, because after Lucky left the building, someone stayed behind, watching, waiting. And Edward Mallory would realize far too late that the interview wasn't the end of the story. It was the warning. 3 minutes after Lucky Luciano exited the building, security footage caught something no one reviewed until much later. A man standing near the service corridor. Not crew, not staff, no badge. He wasn't rushing, wasn't hiding, wasn't nervous. He simply watched, while producers argued, while lawyers shouted, while Edward Mallory sat alone in the studio, trying to remember how control slipped out of his hands. The man waited until Lucky's car disappeared into traffic. Then he turned and walked the opposite direction. Security assumed he was with someone else. That assumption would matter later. Because 2 days after the broadcast, Edward Mallory received a package. No return address, no postage stamp, hand-delivered. Inside was a single VHS tape, no label. Mallory didn't play it right away. He already knew what it was. Still, curiosity has a way of defeating caution. That night, alone in his apartment, Mallory slid the tape into the player. The footage wasn't from the show. It was from before it, a side angle, grainy, shot from somewhere above. The tape showed Mallory in his office weeks earlier, speaking with a man whose face never fully came into view. The audio was faint but unmistakable. Mallory's voice, asking about Harlem, asking about Bumpy Johnson, asking about his wife. Then the tape cut to a second clip. Different location, a bar. Mallory again, listening, nodding, saying nothing. The tape ended abruptly. No message, no threat, just proof. Mallory sat in the dark for a long time. He never reported the tape, never told his wife, never mentioned it to the network, because the tape didn't need explanation. It answered a question Mallory had avoided his entire career. Who is really watching? The next morning, Mallory found a note folded into his newspaper. One sentence, typed, no signature. Some stories are safer. Unfinished. Mallory canceled 3 upcoming investigations that week. Sources noticed, executives noticed, but no one asked why, because asking questions had suddenly become dangerous again. And Lucky Luciano? He never acknowledged any of it. But men close to him would later say something curious, that Lucky always smiled when people asked about the interview, not proudly, not smugly, but knowingly, as if the broadcast had served its purpose long before it ever aired. Because power doesn't announce itself, it reminds you, quietly. And somewhere in New York, years later, when Edward Mallory finally retired from television, he gave one last interview. When asked what the most difficult moment of his career had been, he paused. Then he said, "The night I realized the wrong man was answering my questions." And he never explained further. Years passed. The interview faded from public memory, replaced by newer scandals, louder voices, shorter attention spans. But in certain rooms, it never disappeared. Media changed after that night, subtly but permanently. Producers became cautious about live broadcasts with unpredictable guests. Legal departments gained more authority. Delay buttons appeared where there had been none. Journalists still asked hard questions. They just chose their targets more carefully. Because the interview with Lucky Luciano had exposed an uncomfortable truth, not about crime, but about control. Lucky hadn't gone on television to clear his name. He hadn't gone to threaten anyone. He hadn't even gone to settle a score. He went to demonstrate something. That information is never neutral, and that men who trade in it are rarely as protected as they believe. Edward Mallory had assumed the danger lived in the guest chair. Lucky proved it lived behind the desk, because Mallory represented a new kind of power, quieter than gangsters, cleaner than politicians, and far more insulated. Or so he thought. Lucky understood something. Mallory didn't. That media didn't replace street power. It layered on top of it, and layers can still be peeled back. The real motive became clear to those who knew Lucky well. He was closing accounts, not violently, not publicly, but decisively. The rumor about Bumpy Johnson's wife had lingered for decades because it served a purpose. It kept old alliances fractured. It kept men suspicious. Lucky erased it in one night, not by denying it loudly, but by making its origin too dangerous to repeat. And in doing so, he sent a message to everyone watching. There are limits, not enforced by law, not enforced by fear, but enforced by memory. because memory doesn't forget who planted which seeds. Edward Mallory lived the rest of his life carefully. No scandals, no crusades, no dangerous curiosity. He became what institutions value most, predictable, and Lucky Luciano. He died years later, quietly, without ceremony. But among men who understood power, the interview was remembered as his last move. Not a confession, not a comeback, a demonstration that even stripped of territory, stripped of titles, stripped of armies, a man who understands timing can still change the board. And yet, there is one final detail almost no one noticed. The interview aired on a specific date, not random, not convenient, the anniversary of a meeting where Lucky had once decided who controlled what and who never would. That night, he spoke again, not to the public, but to the same invisible audience, to remind them, some men never stop being dangerous. They just stop needing to prove it. The date of the broadcast was never discussed on air. No one questioned it. No one thought to. But men who lived long enough to remember certain rooms noticed immediately. It aired on the anniversary of the Atlantic City meeting, the day Lucky Luciano reorganized American organized crime, the day bosses stopped acting like kings and started acting like executives, the day violence became inefficient and memory became currency. That date wasn't nostalgia. It was a timestamp, a reminder of who taught the system how to work. Lucky didn't choose the date to celebrate. He chose it to warn. Because the Atlantic City meeting wasn't about power. It was about limits, about what happens when men forget who built the rules they're hiding behind. After the interview, Lucky returned to Italy. No statements, no victory laps, no follow-up appearances, just silence. Until one night. A caretaker at Lucky's villa later told a story he never repeated twice the same way. He said Lucky received a phone call just after midnight. No greeting, no argument, just one sentence spoken into the receiver. Then Lucky hung up. He stood at the window for a long time, didn't smoke, didn't sit, didn't speak. Finally, he said something to no one in particular. They saw it, the caretaker asked. Saw what? Lucky didn't answer. Weeks later, Edward Mallory woke, up to a sound outside his house, not breaking glass, not footsteps, a car engine idling. He looked through the curtain. A dark sedan sat across the street, lights off, no movement. Mallory watched for nearly 10 minutes, then the car drove away. Slowly, no threat, no message. But Mallory never slept through the night again, because once you understand you've been observed, you never stop checking the windows. Years later, when Lucky Luciano died, a reporter asked an old associate what Lucky thought about television. The man laughed. He loved it, he said. It reminded him of something. What? The reporter asked. The man smiled. That people think they're watching when they're really being seen. And that's where the story ends, not with a murder, not with an arrest, but with an image, a quiet street, a dark car, an upstairs light still on, and a man standing at the window realizing too late that some interviews never end. They just move outside. The frame